Welcome back to the quick introduction to Python 3 for AWS Automation Engineers course. Today's video will demonstrate how to work with AWS Lambda service using Python SDK for AWS Boto3 library to deploy AWS Lambda functions, update and invoke them, and manage Lambda permissions for other AWS services. To repeat our examples, you'll need Python 3 interpreter, AWS CLI tools, Boto3 module, and IDE. We'll be using Cloud 9 IDE in this video, but you can use your local IDE such as Visual Studio Code, IntelliJ IDEA, or even a text editor. AWS Lambda is a serverless computing platform that allows you to run code without provisioning or managing servers. AWS Lambda automatically scales your serverless application by running code in response to events and charging you only for the compute time you consume, and there is no charge when your code is not running. With Lambda, you can run code for virtually any application or backend service, all with zero administration. Just upload your code, and Lambda takes care of everything required to run and scale your code with high availability. Your Lambda function code can trigger different AWS services. Or your code can be automatically triggered in response to other AWS services events. Additionally, you can call your Lambda functions directly from any script, web, or mobile app. Check our channel videos to see how you can interact with AWS Cloud APIs using Boto3 library from your Python scripts or Lambda functions. AWS Lambda runs your code on a high-availability compute infrastructure and performs all of the administration of the compute resources, including server and operating system maintenance, capacity provisioning, and automatic scaling, monitoring, and logging. All you need to do is supply the code in one of the languages that AWS Lambda supports: Node.js, Python, Java, C#, and Go. Also, you can use Lambda Custom Runtime, which gives you even more flexibility. To connect to AWS Lambda API using the Boto3 library from your Python script or a Lambda function, you need to use the Boto3 Lambda client. At the time of this video recording, there is no Boto3 resource available for this service. Please check out the quick intro to Boto3 clients and resources video for more information about these options for working with AWS APIs using Boto3. To create a Lambda function using the Boto3 library, you need to use the createFunction method of the Boto3 Lambda client. In addition, you need to archive your AWS Lambda function code and create a Lambda execution IAM role. Let's start with the Lambda execution role first. In our example, we are defining an IAM client role policy statement and calling the createRole method of the IAM client to create the Lambda basic execution role. For more information on working with AWS IAM service using the Boto3 library, check the Working with AWS IAM in Python using Boto3 video. Imagine that you have already created a Lambda function archive named lambda.zip and are willing to deploy it. We'll show how to deploy the Lambda function from its source code folder in a second. To achieve this goal, you need an IAM client to query information about the Lambda role ARN by the role name and the Lambda client itself. Also, we need to read the zip archive file data to the separate variable we'll use in the createFunction method. The createFunction method accepts multiple parameters, and we strongly recommend you check the official Boto3 documentation for more information. In our example, we're using the following self-explanatory arguments: the function name, Lambda function runtime, Lambda function role, and Lambda handler. This is the method that should be executed first when any event triggers your Lambda function. The following argument is the Lambda function code which we feed with the Lambda file archive content. And finally, we're specifying the Lambda execution timeout and several environment variables. When you execute this code, it will deploy the Lambda function named Hello World Lambda to your AWS account. Now, let's consider the following project structure as an example of deploying the Lambda function from the source code. Here, we have a deploy script responsible for the Lambda deployment and the src folder containing the Lambda function source code. Here's an example of the script. which creates a temporary directory on the file system, archives the content of the Lambda source code from the src folder, and deploys the Lambda function. We're using the temp file and shutils Python modules to archive the Lambda function source code. The rest of the code is similar to the previous example. Let's look at how we can invoke the deployed Lambda function. To invoke the Lambda function, you need to use the invoke method of the Boto3 Lambda client. You need to use the payload argument containing JSON string data to send input to your Lambda function. You can access the provided payload data in the Lambda function event argument of the handler function. If the Lambda function returns any data structure, you can access it using the payload key of the Python dictionary returned from the invoke method. We're saving this dictionary in the response variable. You can use Lambda functions versions to save the Lambda function code and its configuration. The Lambda function version is a snapshot of your function code and configuration that doesn't change. Lambda function versions allow us to manage the deployment process. For example, we can publish a new version of a function for beta testing without affecting users of the stable production version. AWS Lambda doesn't publish a version if the function's configuration and code haven't changed since the last version. So, we need to call either update function code or update function configuration to update the function before publishing a version. Clients can invoke Lambda versions directly or with an alias. We'll show how to update the Lambda function and create aliases for its versions in a moment. As for now, to create an AWS Lambda function version using Boto3, we need to use the publish version method of the Lambda client. The returned response will contain the version number assigned to the current deployment configuration. Each Lambda function version can have one or more aliases, or human-readable names for version numbers. A Lambda alias is like a pointer to a specific function version. Clients or AWS services can access the function version using its alias ARN. In summary, when you're calling the Lambda function by its alias ARN, you'll always call the same function code till you repoint the alias to a newer version. Several facts to keep in mind about Lambda aliases. Alias names are unique for a given function. An alias can point only to a function version, not to another alias. And finally, you can update an alias to point it to a new function version. In our example, we're creating an alias named v1 for the first version of the Lambda function named Hello World Lambda. To list Lambda function version aliases, you need to use the list aliases method of the Boto3 Lambda client. For each alias, the response includes information such as the alias ARN, description, alias name, and the function version. You can optionally use the function version parameter to filter out results. To describe the AWS Lambda function, you need to use the getFunction method of the Boto3 Lambda client. The response data will contain the configuration information of the Lambda function and a pre-signed URL to the zip archive with the source code of your function. Please keep in mind that the pre-signed URL is valid for 10 minutes. Optionally, you can use the qualifier argument to specify a version or alias to get details about a published version of the function. To update the AWS Lambda function, you need to use the update function code method of the Boto3 Lambda client. Feel free to modify this example to create the Lambda function code archive from its source on the fly as we did in the deployment process. To delete the Lambda function, you need to use the delete function method of the Boto3 Lambda client. Optionally, you can use the qualifier argument to delete the specific Lambda function version. If the qualifier is not used, this method will delete all Lambda function versions. That's all we wanted to cover in this video. For more information about this topic, please check out the official AWS and Boto3 documentation. These resources are the most up-to-date sources of information. If you'd like to get more information about specific operations with AWS Lambda or any other AWS services using Python and Boto3 library, please let us know in the comments section below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and press the like button. This will help us to publish and spread more educational hands-on content related to cloud automation for the community. Thank you for your attention and stay tuned.